Okay, welcome everybody to the American Enterprise Institute and to this event today on the state of America's colleges and universities. After the Hamas's brutal attack on Israel on October 7th, Americans saw outbursts of anti-Semitism on our college and university campuses that shocked a lot of people who didn't really know what to expect from these places. In congressional hearings shortly thereafter on that subject, two Ivy League presidents performed so poorly that they were subsequently forced to resign from their positions. In the wake of all this, Americans have become attentive to what is going on in our college and university campuses in a way that they haven't been in a very long time. And they don't like what they see. Public support for higher education has recently dropped to historic lows. And higher education is facing challenges more intense, I think, than anything higher education has faced since at least the 1960s and 70s. One dimension of discontent concerns the partisan one-sidedness of the American Academy. As John Shields and Josh Dunn have written in their excellent study of this subject called Passing on the Right, in the most morally and politically freighted of academic disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences, liberals outnumber conservatives by margins of 10 or even 15 to 1. Our AEI colleague, Sam Abrams, did a study of the political identification of academic administrators, found something very similar, an imbalance of approximately 12 liberals for every conservative. Academics, as you can see from these numbers, academics is among the most politically lopsided of all major professions. So, although the partisan imbalance on college and university campuses is a frequent topic of culture war arguments, our intention in convening this panel tonight is not to fire another salvo in the culture war. In fact, prominent academic voices from across the political spectrum have recently been acknowledging and talking about this problem in a really constructive way. So, former Harvard president Derek Bach recently lamented in the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education that an important body of conservative thought is now nearly completely absent on the faculties of many universities. Johns Hopkins president, Ron Daniels, has encouraged universities to embrace what he calls purposive pluralism, which includes pluralism of political outlook. So with a view to these more positive efforts to address the problem of the political imbalance of our campuses, we wanted to convene a panel to think about this problem analytically, to help ourselves understand the causes of the political imbalance on campus, to help us understand the effects of that imbalance, and to help us think about what, if anything, can be done to address it. And so we've invited two speakers to join us who have both a deep knowledge of the life of America's colleges and universities and a deep appreciation for what our colleges and universities, at their best, contribute to American life. So my guests today are Peter Berkowitz, who is a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Peter is a very widely published author. He has written or edited some 11 books and has also served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff and as a senior advisor to the Secretary of State. Peter also leads the Public Interest Fellowship here in Washington, D.C., and taught for many years on the faculty of Harvard University and later George Mason University. We're also joined by Ethan Schrum, who is the director of the Humanities program at Azusa Pacific University and also an associate professor of history there. And he's also an associate fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. And Ethan is the author of a really important book called The Instrumental University: Education in the Service of the National Agenda After World War II. And I think that book sheds essential light on the question of the evolution of the university across the 20th century that can help us understand the political landscape of academia today. So, glad to be joined by Peter and Ethan for this conversation. Ethan Schrum, let me start with you and ask you to give us some historical perspective on the present partisan landscape of our campuses. So you've written in your book about the rise over the course of the 20th century of what you call the instrumental university. So what is the instrumental university? Where did it come from? And how does the history of the rise of the instrumental university, how does that help us understand the ideological landscape of our colleges and universities today?
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for having me here, and glad to talk a little bit about the instrumental university. So I argue that this institution, that there was a change in the major mission of the research university across the course of the 20th century that kind of gathered force in the early decades of the 20th century and then particularly broke out after World War II. And that is the university leaders and leaders in other sectors of society increasingly came to view the university as an instrument for solving social problems and promoting economic growth. And I argue that this shift is grounded in some of the political thought of the early 20th century, particularly in the progressive movement and the New Deal, with certain ideals and fields coming to the fore, kind of related to the idea that there should be rational planning of society, and that universities were not just going to churn out graduates who would do this rational planning of society, but that universities themselves would actually be institutions or instruments, as the language sometimes went, to do this kind of social organization. So I identify a number of fields that tended to have allegiances with democratic and New Deal type politics, such as industrial relations, city planning, different kinds of efforts at public administration, as well as different theories of economic development and how those came to the fore. And then I also talk a lot about how external entities came to see their opportunity to use the university to achieve their own ends. And a lot of this happened through a structure called the Organized Research Unit. So within universities, when you see things called a center or institute of some sort, that's typically an organized research unit. And so some of the big ones that cropped up in the middle of the 20th century included the Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan, the Institute of Industrial Relations at the University of California, and a number of others. And there was even ones that were kind of more explicitly tied to policymaking, such as the role of the University of Wisconsin ORUs in coming up with policies for the Great Society programs, for instance. So certainly by the 1960s, this way of seeing the university was up and running at a pretty full pitch. And I guess just to speak a little bit more to how that kind of maybe pushed out other modes of inquiry, I think in the founding days of the research university in the United States in the late 1800s, there were still a lot of ideals of character formation and virtue formation, even though they looked different than what they had in the classical college. So in the early days of some of the academic disciplines, you had ideas that these disciplines would shape people with particular character traits. Some of the German Bildung ideas were present. But as you move into the 20th century, there's more and more sort of the idea of developing experts at particular techniques. And you hear if you read the post-World War II writings of the leaders of higher education, there's a lot of focus on technicians. That word was really prominent. And so the notion of liberally educating people with moral and civic virtues kind of got pushed out as the attention of institutional leaders went to these more instrumental projects during that era.
And so how does understanding the rise of the instrumental university, how does this help us understand the political character or the ideological atmosphere on campus at present?
Yeah, so I think a key decade is the 1910s, actually. And that was a decade in which American faculty really took a lot of steps toward being professionalized. Like the notion of a faculty role as a professional identity really crystallized during that decade. So for instance, you saw the formation of the American Association of University Professors in 1915. And one of the things that's connected with that professionalization of faculty is the notion that academic departments should have, if not all the say, at least most of the say in hiring decisions, because they have the expertise. And so in maybe older iterations of American higher education, president or other administrators or even trustees played a larger role. And I have a story about this from Princeton. So I'm doing some research on the humanities in the middle of the 20th century, and particularly at Princeton. And they set out in 1946, I believe it was, and the president wanted to fill a vacancy in philosophy, and they still had a sort of idea that Princeton was somewhat of a Christian institution at that time, and that they should have another philosopher who was friendly to religion, at least, in the philosophy department. But they ran into a lot of resistance from the members of the philosophy department, and it ended up taking them 9 years to fill this position. And the guy they ended up getting, Gregory Vlastos, was, in fact, an ordained Christian minister and a kind of Christian socialist. So he was very far to the left. In fact, his wife was, I believe, a member of the Communist Party. And so that's a rather curious story that illustrates this issue. But another response I would give to your question is just thinking, how did university leaders conceptualize the role of the humanities? And so looking at Clark Kerr, who's a very influential president of the University of California, wrote the book, The Uses of the University in 1963. Well, Kerr was a labor economist, and he was in this field of industrial relations that I've talked about. And he developed, along with a few colleagues, this idea of an inexorable industrialism that was taking over the world. And it's really striking to look at some of his inaugural addresses when he became UC president in 1958, and he talks about education being a sort of handmaiden of industrialism. And what would happen with the liberal arts in this new industrial era? Well, Kerr projected things like that everyone would be on a 20-hour work week by 1980. And so the liberal arts would provide opportunities for people to fill their leisure time wisely. And so they became assigned to a category, kind of going back to the idea of the liberal arts as ornamentation rather than essential disciplines for forming citizens of the American Republic.
Okay, so the marginalization of the liberal arts and the dominance of faculty through the departments in the role of university hiring are the basic elements you're pointing us to. So, Peter, you have been writing some about the more recent history of the academic and ideological landscape on our college and university campuses, and you've used this term postmodern progressivism to describe this. Can you tell us what postmodern progressivism is and how it shapes what's going on campus?
Yes, I can tell you, but first, thank you also for the opportunity to be with you here. Well, the short answer is that postmodern progressivism is a fancy way of saying wokeism. But that doesn't really answer the question, because what is wokeism? So maybe a way to approach it is to break it down. 2 words, postmodern, progressivism. Postmodern, after modernism. What is modernism? People who think of themselves as postmoderns really mean by modernism a specific tradition, the modern tradition of freedom. They think of this as the tradition that emerges in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the development of science and technology, commercial life spreads, equality of conditions spreads, and a particular political tradition comes into focus. It's a political tradition that holds, really for the first time, that human beings are by nature free and equal, and it's the job of government to protect this freedom and equality. The postmodern claim is that we live in an era after that tradition. That means that, as it was famously defined, all grand narratives have collapsed, Lyotard, and as an implication, here I paraphrase, actually quote Nietzsche, there are no moral phenomena, only a moral interpretation of phenomena. That means all traditions, including the modern tradition of freedom, are now up for grabs. That's postmodernism. What's progressivism? Well, that's familiar to all of us. Progressivism is a tradition that comes into focus in the United States toward the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And its basic idea is that democracy in the United States has become very complicated. Our Constitution, a constitution of limited, well-defined powers, is inadequate to the task. So we need to develop a core of highly educated, well-credentialed, technocratic experts to administer government, needless to say, on behalf of the people. The problem being that the people are often mistaken about their interests as they express them at the ballot box or through their purchases in the market. But our technocratic experts, we call them elites these days, will make the decisions on behalf of the people. And this will bring about a form of political society in which freedom and equality are more adequately spread and enjoyed. Now, you might say, therefore, that the very idea of postmodern progressivism is a contradiction in terms. Postmodernism, as I said, means that we reject all grand narratives and all claims about the objective reality of morality. And progressivism is a strong claim about how the world ought to be organized. And saying that this is therefore a contradiction in terms, you would be right. But we have to appreciate that it turns out that human beings are not only capable of holding contradictory notions at the same time, we do it often while suppressing the contradiction to ourselves and using various ends of our contradictory notions for various political purposes. Now, if I may, I just want to go back and, if you indulge me, in a bit of history myself, although I'm not trained as a historian. But we can, this postmodern progressivism did not arise suddenly at our universities. Although, as you said, Ben, it's come into focus for many people only recently, after the October 7th attacks, atrocities. But there have been other moments. For example, 2015, I will come back to the controversy over the regulation of Halloween costumes at Yale University. But really, that wasn't the beginning of postmodern progressivism. Here are four moments. That will be the fourth moment. The first moment in the development of postmodern progressivism at our universities, you might say, is the late 1940s, early 1950s, written about in a seminal book by the young William F. Buckley, published shortly after he graduated from Yale University in 1951, called God and Man at Yale. And in that book, some of you in this room have heard me say before, actually Buckley managed to publish his only boring book because even the great William F. Buckley could not make the analysis of college syllabi riveting. But it is important. Buckley, the young Buckley, read syllabus after syllabus in the humanities and social sciences. In the humanities, including at the Yale Divinity School, he discovered that the syllabi, the courses were devoted to teaching atheism. And in the social science class syllabi, through his analysis of Yale's social science department, he discovered that, or he proved his hypothesis that the classes were devoted to teaching collectivism. Atheism and collectivism, statism. These are strong terms, but effectively, the curriculum was already organized around the promotion of progressivism. A few decades later, by the time that Alan Bloom in the late 1980s publishes The Closing of the American Mind, which is really a book built around Bloom's experiences in the late 60s, 70s, early 80s on campus, things have changed. At this moment, what dominates, according to Alan Bloom, is what he calls a soft relativism on campus. A soft relativism meant that students were encouraged to believe that there are no ultimate goods, no final truths. They weren't quite postmodern because they didn't think that everything was up for grabs. Still, on the campuses, most students roughly accepted the established order. They thought it needed to be changed here and there. But even this, what Bloom called gentle relativism, was not really relativism. It too is a kind of dogmatism. Why? Because such matters as biblical faith, classical philosophy, even the essential claims of the American Republic were treated as childhood tales, myths that serious people didn't really believe, at least as they were presented. A third moment is both a moment of intellectual history, but a change in American campuses as postmodern progressivism becomes more deeply entrenched. This moment is recorded in a book by Alan Charles Gores and Harvey Silverglate, published in the late 1990s. The late 1990s, that's 25 years ago, a book called The Shadow University. And the book is about the betrayal on American campuses of the basic principles of a liberal community. That is a community that protects free speech and that protects due process. It's a long book which documents case after case of universities throughout the country where the faculty and the administration attack or fail to defend abuses of academic freedom and abuses of due process in various disciplinary cases concerning students and faculty. All this, by the way, is in the name of advancing what we now call social justice. And the fourth moment, I suppose, inaugurates our present era, and I think does deserve to be considered fully. We have fully entered into postmodern progressivism when Yale University students in the fall of 2015 reject screaming and shouting and denouncing faculty members who gently suggest that Yale students should be responsible for their own Halloween parties, and that when a Yale student encounters a fellow student wearing a costume of which he or she disapproves, the student really has two choices. One, ignore it, or two, take the fellow student to the side and explain why the student thinks that this costume is appropriate. But no, the students demanded and really effectively got removed from their positions. What were then called the master and the deputy master, maybe, assistant master of the colleges. Actually, another expression of postmodern progressivism. Yale University proved incapable of recognizing that the word master in the English language has not one but two definitions. One definition means effectively the boss of somebody else, and the other means someone who has achieved excellence in a field. But what I mean about the coming into existence of this postmodern progressivism era is that these two ideas become combined. One is the collapse of all grand narratives, meaning all the old traditions, all the established practices, all the claims of universal standards, including the one at the foundation of the American Republic, have been discredited. We have to change things from the bottom up and from the top down. But second, and this is why it's so different even from the closing of the American mind, we now know the final truth about matters. We know exactly how things have to be changed. We, the students, know that these professors who believe that students ought to regulate their own parties, not the administration, are immoral, are engaged in the terrible act of invalidating students' humanity, and must be removed from their positions. And that was 2015. It is now 2024. I think we remain in this era in which the universities are, to a significant extent, there are, as you know, countervailing developments, and this doesn't describe every last person on the campuses, but we are deeply rooted in the era of postmodern progressivism on campus.
So with this historical background of the instrumental university and its undermining of the liberal arts, the rise of departmental authority over hiring, and the ideological rise of these combination of forces that Peter has called postmodern progressivism, I want to turn now to the more precise question of the political composition of faculties and administrations in our present moment. Let me offer you all a couple of arguments that are proffered in defense of the leftward slant of the contemporary university. One of these is an argument made by Michael Berube in a book called What's Liberal About Liberal Education, which was published 20 years ago, but which I think makes an argument that still has a lot of purchase. He says that the right is, the political right is fundamentally authoritarian, and it's intrinsically opposed to free and open inquiry. And while Berube made this argument a while ago, a lot of people see some confirmation of this point of view about the right in our Trump right era, if that's an adequate way to characterize it. So Ruth Ben-Ghiat, writing in the New York Review of Books, she says that authoritarians depend on degrading real knowledge and expertise. And if the right is authoritarian, and authoritarianism depends on degrading real knowledge and expertise, then it makes sense that the right would just be, the political right would just be a foreign element on campus. And so this argument that the authoritarian right belongs excluded from campus, or rather that the right is essentially authoritarian and as such belongs excluded from campus, dovetails with another view that's common in academic circles, that liberals are more intelligent and care more about social justice than conservatives, and that conservatives tend to be greedier than liberals, and so go into more lucrative lines of work. On the intellectual side of this, some people argue that the academic mind, as it's sometimes described, is intrinsically progressive. So it makes sense that conservatives would end up elsewhere. So for all these reasons, people suggest that it's just perfectly natural that campus should have a leftward slant, and even perhaps an extreme leftward slant. What do you all make of these arguments? Ethan, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Well, they remind me of things from the past. I don't think these arguments are particularly new. I think back to somebody like Richard Hofstadter, the Columbia University historian who wrote books on anti-intellectualism in American life and the paranoid style in American politics, made some of these kinds of arguments in the 1950s and 60s. And even earlier, John Dewey, who was considered the voice and conscience of liberal America from, say, the 1920s and 30s, spoke extensively about the danger of authoritarianism, and he particularly denigrated Catholics for being authoritarian. And Dewey was one of the founding figures of the American Association of University Professors that I mentioned earlier. So there are some connections there. And I think going back to that founding of the AAUP and looking at some of those documents, they talk about what qualifies someone to be a professor and to have academic freedom. And there are some notions of scientific expertise that they throw around, kind of assuming or perhaps implying that those are neutral, when in fact a lot of people would argue that they are typically not neutral. So those are a few historical precedents to that situation.
Peter, what do you think?
I think these are ignorant and frivolous arguments. Let's start with authoritarian. That the idea that the conservatives are authoritarian and therefore have no place in the universities. First of all, this misses that there is always if not authoritarian, a necessity of submitting to authority in all education. There is a discipline, after all. And this, by the way, goes through every activity. If you're learning basketball, if you're learning dancing, or if you're learning music, or if you're learning to read, you don't just start making things up, expressing your own freedom. You submit to the discipline of an authority, so presumably somebody who knows how to read, or knows how to dance, or knows how to play basketball. And in the course of your education, acquiring the skills in these various activities, of course you eventually reach a condition in which, out on the court, in the constantly new situations you find yourself, or on the dance floor, you know how to adapt. You know how to use your teammates or your dance partners. But this is a result of years of study, of submission, and practice. The equivalent in liberal education is that, of course, we want to develop students' moral imaginations. Of course, we want to develop students' ability to think for themselves. But students can't learn to think for themselves unless they first master the basics. So first I hear in those criticisms an aversion to the very notion of discipline, and therefore an ignorance of what all education, not least liberal education, consists in. Second, if I remember another one of your points, conservatives care less about social justice. Well, social justice designates a partisan interpretation of justice. Social justice means left-wing justice. So by definition, I suppose conservatives care a little less about left-wing justice, but that doesn't mean that conservatives don't care about justice. But in any case, why would someone think that the purpose of liberal education is to pursue social justice? I would have thought that the purpose of liberal education is to pursue knowledge about the country in which we live, its founding principles, its constitutional traditions. I would have thought the purpose of education is to pursue knowledge of the civilization of which the United States is a part, the treasures of that civilization, to learn how to think about those treasures, to learn arguments on both sides of the great questions, so that the critics are, I think, right that conservatives reject the idea that liberal education should be about the pursuit of social justice. But in rejecting it, conservatives are right, and conservatives show a much better appreciation of what is the core mission of a liberal education. I think I may have missed one of the criticisms, but
The last one was that conservatives are greedy, and that's why they don't opt into poorly paying academic jobs. And I think all of us can testify that academic jobs are, in fact, poorly paying.
Yes, but it would be interesting to run that experiment. First of all, I think, in general, we're not allowed to put forward rank comprehensive generalizations about classes of people. Some conservatives are greedy, but my experience, you can find a few greedy people here and there on the left. Second, we should run this experiment because the fact is, in ways that are explicit and in ways that are covert, the dominant forces at our universities make it next to impossible for people with conservative sensibilities or people who wish to study subjects that have been designated as conservative to even gain a foothold in the university.
Peter, let me follow up here, if I could, with an argument that's used to explain the leftward tilt of the university that I find more plausible, which is an argument put forward by a man named Neil Gross in this very good book called Why Are Professors Liberal and Why Do Conservatives Care? And he argues there that the academic profession is typecast by both sides as a liberal profession. That is, liberals project that this is something that liberals are welcome to do, that they will be happy in doing, that campus is a place for them. Conservatives, when they encounter students who might be interested in academic careers, say that's not really for you. And that is actually part of the problem, is that it creates a pipeline problem, as it were. It keeps young conservatives who might be interested in academic careers from going in. What do you think of that?
Yes, but I wouldn't use the word projection. It is made clear to undergraduates that that places in graduate programs are reserved for people who care about social justice. Indeed, with some large percentage of colleges and universities now, we have a requirement to sign loyalty statements to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Moreover, let's say you care deeply about politics and you want to study war, or let's say you want to study religion, or let's say you want to study the free market, or these days, let's say you want to study Plato and Aristotle. Your opportunities in graduate school are very slender. If you're fortunate enough to obtain a position in graduate school, finding a mentor will be very difficult. If you're lucky enough to find a mentor and obtain your PhD, the number of positions open for somebody who studies war or religion or the free market or the history of political thought, they're very limited. If the person is lucky enough to find such a position, the chances of gaining tenure, given the preponderance of this person's colleagues, will regard such subjects as inherently less serious, or, in this case, projecting, believes that anybody who studies war must be a warmonger, or anybody who studies religion must be determined to proselytize religious faith. So in that respect, I suppose it's true that thoughtful conservatives will look at the landscape out there and say, this is not a world for me. But what I object to is the suggestion that somehow this is a good state of things. Instead, what we would ordinarily say, if the universities have become explicitly hostile environments for a certain class of people and a certain set of ideas, we would normally say the university needs to be reformed. We wouldn't say, well, too bad for that class of people and that set of ideas.
Ethan, you're welcome to jump in on that point. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, one thought is, there is a tendency, at least for a good number of conservatives, to value place and family. And those things can present obstacles to the kinds of long years of education in perhaps very specific places necessary.
From postdoc to postdoc.
Well, even before that, going to graduate school potentially in a far-flung place, as Peter was suggesting, there might be a very small number of advisors willing to work with students on some of these topics that interest conservatives more. So one might have to be willing to leave home and family, and in terms of things like marriage and children, perhaps to delay because of not only the moving around, but also the low income associated with graduate student stipends, for instance.
Okay, so you accept the notion that there is there may be some measure of conservative self-selection out of the academic profession. I want to come back to something Peter was pointing to a minute ago. In what way does this imbalance, if it does, distort the activities intrinsic to academic life? That is, in what ways does it distort teaching and research on our college and university campuses? Go ahead, Peter.
It distorts it fundamentally. Now it needn't, because to deliver liberal education, to engage in liberal education, all other things being equal, You don't need an even balance of people who vote for Democrats and people who vote for Republicans. But we live in a world in which a significant proportion of faculty have adopted the view that it's their job, through the curriculum, through the courses they teach, to promote a partisan left-wing view, as one of the authors you cited said, to promote social justice. There's another problem we haven't mentioned, which is not political, and which is the idea that professors should use the college curriculum to teach their specialty, which is also inconsistent with providing a liberal education. In any case, we have the testimony from just last month of Harry Lewis. Harry Lewis is a former dean of Harvard College. He's a graduate of Harvard College in 1968. He's a longtime professor of computer science there. Lewis has been at Harvard for 50 years and part of the establishment of the university. And he wrote a column for the Harvard Crimson in which he said, going back to, Ben, where you began, with the outburst of anti-Semitism on campus of October 7th, he said, the real problem on our campuses is not anti-Semitism. The real problem on our campuses is that the curriculum has been hijacked by professors who think the purpose of their courses is to promote their left-wing identity politics view. He calls for a return to a kind of curriculum where professors have an obligation to teach the great books and the great ideas and present the arguments on both sides. Even then, all other things being equal, you wouldn't need people who vote Republican to do that. But the present faculty has to a significant extent proved itself incapable of creating, maintaining, delivering a curriculum which deals with the great ideas and the arguments on both sides of them. So it seems to me significant measures need to be adopted to make up for that.
Ethan, what would you say on this question?
Yeah, I think going back again to provide some historical perspective on the notion of student choice of courses, and even getting back to the notion that Peter was talking about a few minutes ago of students learning to think for themselves and what kind of basic knowledge and fundamentals are required for that. I think we have to go back to Harvard at the turn of the 20th century under the presidency of Charles William Eliot, one of the most influential figures in the history of American education. He was president of Harvard for 40 years. And by the time he was done in 1909, I believe the number of required courses for Harvard students were down to 2. I think there was freshman writing and one other thing. So he had a distinctive understanding of liberty and the way that students should practice their liberty by choosing courses and making mistakes, as he said they inevitably would. But that whole idea of very wide choice in courses goes back a long way. And so there are philosophical roots of that should be further investigated to add on to this discussion.
Okay, so if we take this to be a problem, I don't think it's a problem that anybody thinks is easy to fix. Are there any measures out there that you all think are particularly promising for addressing the partisan imbalance of the university's professional ranks?
Yes. Very briefly, of course, there's it's a project that you are centrally involved in, and Jen as well, programs of civic thought, creating within universities small programs centered around especially political ideas and institutions central to the United States, and spreading beyond that. There are, as many of you in this room know, especially in the last couple of years, been efforts to create centers of liberal education at great flagship universities, at flagship public universities around the country. I think we should continue to do our best to work within established universities. And within established universities, I suppose I would focus, as Jen and I have discussed, I would focus on efforts to bring to the attention of faculty, administrators, and boards of trustees the indispensable importance of curricula covering topics that are have always been central to humanity. I've mentioned two of them already: war and religion. The study of military history has almost been banished from our elite universities, and there's been, excuse the expression, a war on the study of diplomatic history and political history as well. But focusing on filling in the curriculum would begin to restore balance, but also finally making an argument for basic requirements. There's virtually no elite university in the country who says there's some basic ideas and basic books with which all educated people must be familiar. I can't think of one elite university that does that. We need to do what's in our power to restore this common sense and true opinion about education.
Let me just offer one short comment on what Peter's saying before I get to Ethan's reaction to that question. Peter, what I think you're describing, what I've, and Jen and I have tried to describe about building programs in which conservatives tend to work as a way to address this problem, which needs to be distinguished from anything like what people sometimes call affirmative action for conservatives or the creation of counter-ideological programs. You're not suggesting the creation of something that's going to promote a conservative ideology. You're suggesting we should hire some people in areas like diplomatic history that have been emptied out.
Yes, yes, I would put it 2 points there. What I'm actually suggesting is not hiring conservatives, but what I'm suggesting is the educational mission is in significant measure about conserving the ideas, the opinions, the history of Western civilization and thinking independent thoughts about them. If you did that, you would end up hiring quite a number of conservatives. But there is a second point, I think it's already been mentioned. Rare is the university that actually teaches explicitly conservative ideas. Rare is the university where you can take a course on modern conservative, 20th century American conservatism, where you can study Friedrich Hayek and Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer and Irving Kristol and Jean Kirkpatrick. Since that's a crucial part of American political thinking, it should be part of the curriculum too. And if you can find someone who is very knowledgeable in those writers, there's a decent likelihood that person will be a conservative.
Could be.
Could be.
We'll go to questions in a minute, but I want to get Ethan's response to this.
Sure. So I think one of the things about the civic thought schools that's particularly important is that they have some independent ability to make hiring and tenure decisions like a traditional academic department. So that is a key component. I would say in terms of the instrumental university, one of the curiosities is that I mentioned earlier this organized research unit, this structure of the instrumental university. Well, this basically involved one or more faculty members setting up a center or institute based on a number of external grants, some sort of external funding source. Well, over time, conservatives figured out that this is a structure they could try to use to their advantage.
Right.
To set up programs, institutes, centers within universities that maybe were not explicitly conservative, but that at least attempted some sort of viewpoint diversity or attempted to be insulated from academic fads and jargon and things of that nature. And I do muse a little bit toward the end of my book about what Robert Nisbet would think of that. So Nisbet was one of those rare conservative sociologists and a former scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute. Right. And he was highly critical of organized research units in his book, The Degradation of the Academic Dogma, in 1971. But I wondered if he had lived a little longer, what he would have thought of conservatives trying to turn those organized research units to their advantage.
Maybe you'll found the Nisbet Center
Yeah.
for Conservative Sociology.
I do think one more thing, Peter mentioned boards of trustees briefly, but I was thinking especially at small liberal arts colleges, right? There are some statistics on some of these institutions have the greatest examples of ideological homogeneity, and it's almost going to take a wholesale culture change promoted by the board for things to change in those places, I think.
Okay, with that, we've got some time for audience questions. I'm going to recognize you in a kind of vague gesture because I have a lot of light pouring into my eyes. I cannot actually see your faces. This gentleman up front here. Oh, and there are microphones that will come around.
Mark Lerner. I just wanted to know, what about Ayn Rand's idea about why universities were liberal? She said, and I want to see if I can get it correct, but she said that these universities were filled with left-wing professors because they couldn't earn money as producers any other way. So they ended up in the university and taught a social system where there was a redistribution of wealth because that's the only way they could live.
I don't know how one would check. I would say that most of my left-leaning colleagues in the university seem to be there because there were things that they cared to study, and so in that sense, I don't question the sincerity of some of their academic motives. But I don't know. What do the two of you think?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think that's probably unlikely. I'm not familiar with all the details of Rand's perspective on that, but like Ben, a number of left-leaning colleagues who are very passionate about their subjects, their disciplines, and so forth.
Yeah, I would add that the way I gestured at this at the beginning, the scholarly enterprise and the teaching enterprise has an indispensable conservative dimension. Yes, it's about, as I said, developing the moral imagination, refining the ability to think for yourself, but that can only be done if the mind is first furnished with the treasures of Western civilization. So I don't think it captures everybody, especially during Ayn Rand's heyday, who are going to the university. That having been said, there is a sense, not the sense in which she mentioned it, in which I suppose people who are attracted to the university for the right reason are liberal, but it's in the sense of this term, liberal education. What is liberal education? Liberal education is an education for freedom. So in that sense, the best people who are attracted to the universities should be liberal. They should understand that their job is to help equip those who are less advanced in these studies to be citizens of a free republic. And part of that, coming to be a more responsible citizen of a free republic, is understanding the republic in which you live and the civilization of which it's a part, and the wider world. But that is, in the old-fashioned sense of the meaning, liberal.
Let's see. This gentleman back here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lamont Jones. I'm managing editor for education at U.S. News and World Report. And like many others, we've written quite a bit about what many call a crisis in confidence in higher education. There's the cost issue. There are many others. The topic we're discussing this evening, how much do you think is attributed to that in terms of some general public sentiments or specific? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll make one comment on this, which is that the collapse, there's an astonishing collapse in public confidence in higher education that has been reported on in a long and excellent story by Paul Tuff in the New York Times, in which he described how in the early 2010s, his numbers, and these are very impressive, but I think reminiscent of something real. His numbers are that in that era, something like 96% of parents said 96% of Democratic parents said they expected their children to go to college, and 99% of conservative parents said they expected the same thing. So there was this astonishing love of higher education on both sides of the political aisle. And I can remember this as an abiding American reality where nobody was against college. And that has collapsed, and its collapse is bipartisan in the sense that the numbers of Americans who say they have high confidence in higher education has dropped across the board, across all political stripes, but it is definitely led by Republicans. And so since 2015, I think in 2015, Republicans, I think it was about 59% of Republicans said that they had a high degree of confidence in higher education, and that has dropped to 19%. And so there's a very dramatic partisan fall off in conservative confidence in higher education. In that sense, I think this has to do with this has something to do with the ideological disposition of campus. Certainly the cost issues and these kinds of things, they can cross-cut with these things and are part of the equation, but there seems to be something ideological about it.
In around 2000, the great Tom Wolfe published a recollection. He said that he'd been living in Manhattan for 30 years. He said he'd attended endless dinner parties in which he met young couples. And he said there wasn't a young couple, parents of a young Johnny or Jenny, who didn't say to him, "My great dream for Johnny or Jenny is that one day he or she will attend Harvard, Yale, or Princeton." And Wolfe comments, in all of those dinner parties with all of those young couples, not a single couple expressed the slightest interest in the quality of education offered by Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. The idea was the rewards of going to these elite universities was so great that the education, okay, maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. Ben mentioned 2015, maybe the year of the Halloween costume controversy. I suspect that what's begun to happen is that parents have really begun to think two things. One, the education question is not neutral. It might be downright harmful. But especially since October 7th, parents are thinking, and by the way, that credential, which I always assumed will be so valuable to Johnny or Jenny, regardless of what they learn or don't learn, Harvard, that credential might now be seen as a detriment, as a stain on their record. After all, by the way, there are now at least 2 federal judges who've said this has to do with legal education, but they will not consider, for the time being, hiring clerks who graduate from Yale Law School. So I think, cost is very important, although the federal government keeps increasing the support. So it's, it's a kind of Ponzi scheme. But also I think as the actual substance of the education is coming more into focus, I think parents are coming to reconsider this investment, and maybe looking again at places like Arizona State University, University of Texas, University of Florida, with special programs devoted to an older understanding of education.
Ethan, you got a thought on this?
Just very briefly, I would say that another couple of factors are probably the dawn of the social media age and the way that changes people's perceptions of things, as well as the pandemic and the whole experience of having college students going home and taking courses online from home, and parents perhaps being more involved in seeing what was going on at a more intimate and granular level.
This lady right here.
This may sound too much like a statement, but I'll try to end it with a question. In 1969, I had occasion to, I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and I had occasion to read every catalog going back to the founding in 1892.
Wow.
nothing on. What struck me was the malleability of the curricula, and not just the courses, but the departments in which things were offered. That it shifted and changed over time in a
Yes.
wide variety of ways. Now, what prompted this was a revolt among women at the university over their almost total exclusion from the intellectual offerings of the university. And I'll skip all the detail. So what I find myself saying is what you're talking about today is just a point in time in something that fluctuates wildly. I shouldn't say wildly, but it fluctuates considerably depending on a wide variety of pressures, some of which come from the students, some of which come from world events, some of which come from the government. And as I looked at the curricula, I would try and identify what may have been crucial at that particular point in time. And in some cases, I could identify what was crucial. So have you, have any of you considered the fact that this is simply a point in time in what is essentially a Mississippi River?
Yes, I appreciate the question. And I think the point that you're making, which is that the content of the curriculum, even the organization of the curriculum changes over time, is perhaps a way out of the kind of dilemma that we're describing. In other words, if there are significant shifts in the organization of the curriculum over time because we've, for example, overlooked a significant area of human experience that deserves to be studied, well, I think what we're describing is a significant area of human experience that deserves to be studied. And if we need to create if we need to think about the organization of the university, perhaps create new academic units to help us address these things, that's a reasonable course of proceeding that has a lot of precedence, as you're pointing us to.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think you're speaking about kind of the dynamic of specialization in the university. And so going back to what I was saying earlier about Charles Eliot at Harvard at the turn of the 20th century, one of the main transformations of the American university was the advent of specialization, and this was connected with the kind of professionalization of professors in the early 20th century. But what then formed as a counter movement to push back against specialization is the general education movement. And that reminds me of, I think, an opportunity for faculty to be involved in trying to get to more of a common learning for students. What Peter was talking about earlier. Are there certain books that every college graduate should read, certain principles of a free society that every college graduate should be familiar with? This is something that general education revision is occurring on campuses. There are funding opportunities for it. It's a place where faculty can get involved, often involves a lot of work, a lot of service work, but it's a place to shape the curricular requirements for every student. And there are, again, some programs like with the Teagle Foundation and other places currently that are promoting, reviewing, revising general education. So that's another opportunity.
If I may, of course, 20th century, 21st century, times of extraordinary change. But I can't think of a single change that for any reason should dislodge, let's say, Plato and Aristotle, Augustine and Aquinas, the principles of the American founding, the American constitutional tradition, modern literature, modern history, the study of war and religion, from the center of the curriculum. Have women been neglected? Yes, women should not be neglected. Have the histories of historically discriminated against minorities been neglected? They've been neglected. They should not be neglected. But we're talking about a core curriculum, and all these neglected subjects are still subjects about human beings. And the study, I still think the best that we can do in the study to study human beings and all their amazing variety and continuity is what in the 19th century, in his great statement on liberal education, Mill set forth, and then too began with the classics and revolved around the governing principles of his own society and an ascent through the great ideas and great books of Western civilization.
I think Tom Merrill?
Thank you. So thank you, Ben, for hosting this conversation. I want to ask a question about postmodernism as Peter presented it and relate it to an observation about the tensions on campus. Peter presented postmodernism as the movement that's rejecting modernism, by which you seem to identify with, let's say, the founding, Locke, Montesquieu, things like that.
Among others, yeah.
But one might think that what postmodernism was rejecting was precisely the thing that Ethan was talking about. Let's say the idea of a technocratic ability to manage the economy, the bureaucracy of modern life, all of those kinds of things. That was much closer to the motives that generated whatever postmodernism was or is. And so I wonder, and as I see my campuses today, and I see lots of tension, it's by no means a placid realm of ideological agreement. When you talk to student activists, for example, in the realm of Title IX sexual assault, precisely the thing that they're angry about is the bureaucracy of the university. Precisely the thing they're angry about is the modern idea that somehow you could manage all of these things, and that when we're sexual assault survivor, as they call themselves, goes into the system, that their humanity is in some way being denied. I wonder if you could talk about that tension, because that to me seems like the thing that is actually moving universities. That there's this tension within the regime itself.
There is a tension, but I don't think it's quite right that they're raging against the university's management. Or they're not raging against the idea that the university is managing things. They're raging against the manner in which the university manages things. At the universities over the last 25 years, what we've seen is an expansion of the university's responsibility and the demand of students that they do so with the assistance of the Obama administration in 2011, and then the Biden administration, which revived the Dear Colleagues letter of April 2011, giving the universities broad new powers in cases involving allegations of sexual assault. Now, there have been problems on campus. But it seems to me, as we acquire a better understanding of the issues of sexual assault, and as we all can agree that rape is a heinous crime, it seems to me entirely appropriate that that heinous crime be investigated by the police department. But the postmodern progressives do not want police departments investigating allegations of sexual assault. They want deans, and they want faculty committees, and they want to eliminate classical due process protections. And by the way, they want to do this based on an ideology. What is that ideology? It's the ideology that was set forth in writings of Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon in the 1980s. These authors are no longer read, but they don't have to be read because their ideas have been internalized in the university administration. Actually, DEI is, in a way, expression of this. The ideology that was internalized and now governs much of the administration of these grievance procedures is that we live in a male supremacist society. Women cannot give meaningful consent to sex. That includes wives, by the way. And therefore, any allegation of sexual assault, if it's agreed upon that there was some kind of sexual encounter, is prima facie rape, because women was incapable of giving consent. And that needs to be adjudicated by the administration. So this is what I mean. It's not at all a repudiation of the administrative state. It is a hijacking of the administrative state on behalf of a radical ideology.
Ethan, any thoughts on the relationship between postmodernism and progressivism and the bureaucratic state of the university?
For sure. So it's definitely very interesting to trace the uses of postmodern. So the term really started appearing in the 1930s, and initially a lot of religious people saw the postmodern as a sign of hope for them in helping to end their marginalization within the university. There's a remarkable volume from the 1950s called Religion in the State University, in which you have Will Herberg and John Courtney Murray as spokespeople for their respective faith communities talking about how promising the advent of the postmodern is. But then later on, you do get a different understanding of the postmodern, particularly after the mid-1960s. And I often focus on Richard Rorty, someone, and particularly the way he came out of what I call the Princeton complex with their vision for religion and the humanities to a different sort of position. And thinking about Rorty's revival of pragmatism in a more postmodern sense, Rorty rejected the optimism about science that was characteristic of many of the early pragmatists like Charles Peirce and John Dewey. And Rorty's vision was more that everyone is just making up stories, and really who has the power to tell the most compelling story is the person who's going to win. So for instance, in his essay on postmodernist bourgeois liberalism from the early 1980s, he kind of articulates this basis for why we should have liberal democracies that respect freedoms. It's just because we like them, not because they're grounded in anything eternal or universal or that can be arrived at by reason or other intellectual modes.
I remember when I was a young assistant professor, a lecture he gave at Harvard about diplomacy, foreign policy. And his understanding of diplomacy was summarized in a slogan as you're saying, we should go around the world and say about American democracy, try it, you'll like it.
We have time for one more question. Josh Roquette.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Peter. That was great. I wonder whether you could both say a little bit more about what you take to be the wider historical perspective here. So one of you took us back to Bill Buckley, the other took us back to President Eliot in the 1910s and Dewey. Does it make any sense to go back further? What I'm thinking of here is, unfortunately, a book that I haven't read that I only learned about this morning. There's a review in Law and Liberty this morning by Scott Yaynor of a book by Jeffrey Paul called Winning America's Second Civil War. And according at least to this review, which I highly recommend to everybody, although as I said, I haven't yet read the book, according to this review, the rise of progressive social sciences and the rise of the administrative state in universities is the direct result of 19th century German research universities and what that did to the United States. So I'm just wondering whether you think there's any truth to that at all, and whether there's any truth to that at all, just how far back would you be willing to go? What's the starting point of what one might call the madness? Thanks.
Why don't you go first then?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. There are some interesting linkages for sure between Germany and the United States. It's a pretty complicated story, as Emily Levine has recently told in her book, Allies and Rivals, on the German-American exchange in the era of the creation of the research university. It's certainly the case with some of the progressive social scientists. They were taking up German ideas, and even in the realm of social policy, Germany, Wilhelmine Germany in the early 20th century had a much more advanced welfare state than the United States did. And for instance, when the FDR administration wanted to create Social Security, they looked to what was going on in Germany. So it's a complicated story, but there are a lot of linkages there for sure.
Add briefly, there are two senses in which we could go farther back. One sense is we go farther back to trace the stages of decline. Another sense in which we go farther back is to identify true and inspiring models for what liberal education ought to be today. I only have a moment or two here, so plus you're a classicist, so I won't take us back to Plato and Aristotle. But I do recommend that on the way back there, we stop in 1867. In 1867, John Stuart Mill, as honorary rector of the University of St. Andrews, delivered an inaugural lecture. The lecture was on the purpose of liberal education. It is a great and almost entirely neglected speech. Since you're a classicist, I will mention that in one passing comment, Mill says, we should not teach Greek and Latin at the university. The reason is, if you don't know Greek and Latin by the time you reach the university, it's too late for you. At the university, we should be studying Plato and Aristotle in Greek. In any case, Mill gives an account of liberal education that, by the way, also, that first of all attempts to explain how we incorporate new subjects, like the natural sciences, like physiology, into the standard curriculum. And then he speaks about how liberal education should be an ascent in the humanities, starting close to home with our nation's basic political institutions. That includes political economy, expands out into a study of international law, and culminates with a study of ethics and politics and religious opinions. It does so aggressively. It does so in a spirit of inquiry and not in a spirit of proselytization. And it culminates, it's an education that culminates with students whose moral imagination has been expanded, whose capacity for thinking has been refined, and who therefore will make good citizens in a free society. So I'd go back at least to 1867.
I'll just add one last comment here that, I think Peter's evocation of this beautiful ideal of liberal education, or the beautiful ideal of liberal education one might find in somebody like John Henry Newman, these are really important things, really important sources for us to draw from. But of course, none of them could be simply stamped onto our moment. And one has to understand both the ways in which we'd want the substance of liberal education to draw on new sources that we've learned about in the meantime, and secondly, make use of the tools that are available to us on the landscape that we face. And so we'll need to. We're not going to simply return to the classical college, as it is sometimes described. We're going to have to build something that makes sense within the landscape of higher education that we face right now. Okay, we'll have to close it there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Ethan Schrum and Peter Berkowitz for their wisdom.
Thank you.